you. Right, we're ready to go. Okay, evening, ladies and gentlemen. If it's all right, I'll start with the usual way. We're reading the minutes of the last meeting, the most exciting part of the evening. An ordinary meeting at the Royal Archaeological Institute was held in the rooms of the Society of Antiquaries of London on the 8th of January 2025 at 5 p.m. The President, Ms. Natalie Cohen, is in the chair. Professor Stephen Mythen presents a paper on a Mesolithic experience, excavations at Ruo Port and Chelich, Isle of Islay. Questions were asked by Elizabeth Tingle, Kate Starling, Isaac Jarvis, Adrian Tills, Andrew David, and Ian Clark, and the meeting ended at 6:15 p.m. Are you happy that's a true record of the meeting? Anyone who's here? Good. You may sign them.
Thank you very much. Duly signed. Okie doke. It is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. James Wright, who is the author of this wonderful book, Historic Building Myth-Busting, which I strongly encourage all of you, if you do not already own at least one copy, if not two, that you need another, or your first. It really is a pleasure to have James here this evening. He's going to be talking to us tonight about the search for Britain's oldest pubs. So I'm sure we are all going to leave well versed in historic pub lore. Hand over to James. Thank you so much.
Good evening. First, an admission, I think. This is the second time I've spoken in this room about old pubs in 3 months. I was asked to speak for the Society of Antiquaries as well, and I gave a more general talk on the myth-busting book, which included about 10 minutes on pubs. I don't think any of you were in that meeting, though, so I might get away with this. But I am going to speak for about 50 minutes or thereabouts about one of the stupidest yet most interesting things I've ever done, namely try and find Britain's oldest pub. There are so many claimants. Wherever you go in the country, there's some business who are strapping this claim to the sign of their pub, saying, we're the oldest in the town, we're the oldest in the county, or we're the oldest in the country. And that oldest in the country is something which it holds a certain cachet for the business because it does genuinely pull in the punters. So there is a financial element to it, but also for the locals as well. So I live about 1.5 miles from this pub that you can see on the right-hand side of your screens, the Old Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham. And I used to work in there when I was a student in 1998-99, and people came from all over the world because they thought it was Britain's or England's oldest inn. It really did have a magnetic pull. And when I say from all over the world, I think I'd been working there about 2 weeks when the Finn brothers from the Australian rock band Crowded House came in for a pint. You know, it's that kind of level of people. They were playing at the Theatre Royal and they were brought in by their tour manager. We pulled them some pints. They sat down and marvelled at this ancient building. So the claim's made, but it's not very often interrogated. So lots of archaeologists have thought about this subject, I'm sure. Archaeologists historically do tend to like a pint, but maybe no one's ever previously pulled together the data to have a genuine look at what the evidence is for ancient pubs. When I did the historiography for the chapter in the book on pubs, I was shocked, frankly, at how little has been written on this subject. And it's almost one of those subjects which perhaps people felt a sense of embarrassment about, that this wasn't a serious thing to look at as an archaeologist. So the field was actually wide open. There was very, very little information. Very little has been published on genuinely ancient inns. at all. So there was relatively few site reports, almost nothing in the way of monographs, journal articles. There's one of the earliest articles is a short piece published in 1961 in a Festschrift by William Pantin, and that really is still the last word on the subject, 1961. So I'm going to talk to you for about 50 minutes anyway about that. I just want to introduce myself to build on Natalie's kind introduction. I'm Dr. James Wright. I'm a buildings archaeologist. I run a small heritage consultancy based in Nottingham, but I work all over the country. And that has included quite a bit of research on pubs, both ancient and modern. I specialise in buildings archaeology, which is a relatively new discipline to archaeology. It's only really been a professional, commercial job for about 35, 40 years, something like that. I can be found mainly doing things like planning application work and conservation projects for people such as the National Trust, and also private research for landowners of ancient buildings who want to find out more about the buildings that they live or work in. I do believe that you've got a responsibility to tell people what you've found, so I do get out there and I do broadcast my findings on these projects in all sorts of ways, including doing these in-person talks and also online lecturing. I do a bit of broadcasting, bits of TV, bits of radio, and a fair amount of podcasts, and of course I write as well. And archaeologists certainly have the function and the facility to put out their journal articles or their monographs, but quite frankly, I'm happy to use any media available, whether it's writing apps or websites or blogs. I'll use any opportunity. But we are here tonight for the possibility that I can yak on for a bit about medieval pubs, which was the subject of the final chapter in the historic building myth-busting book. And it has been said by several of my friends that this was essentially the most extravagant yet covert pub crawl of them all. Yes, dear, I'm off to do some more research this evening, that kind of thing. Because I did obviously get to visit many of these properties to have a really good hunt round to essentially verify their age. So I'm going to talk to you about this final chapter in the book. It's about 12,000 words long. It's sort of the length of a journal article, if you like, a decent-sized journal article. I'm going to start by talking about Nottingham's oldest pub because I live in Nottingham, and obviously, as I've already said, I worked in the trip to Jerusalem, and the chapter opens with the trip as a case study. It's usually said to date to 1189. I'm going to have a quick look to check if that's true or not. Then I want to, after using the Nottingham claimants, and there are 3 of them, as an introductory case study, I just really want to have a look more broadly at the corpus of buildings which claim to be the oldest pub in the country. Just see some running themes, some tropes which appear in the evidence which is weighed in to try and back them up. A very short look at the general history of medieval pubs, what sort of buildings we might expect to see in the data set, and then finally a more lengthy look at inns as a class of monument. Just really a note to say that the research that went into this chapter was very much based on buildings archaeology. And as I said, it's a discipline that's perhaps gone fully professional with a name, buildings archaeology, for about 35 or 40 years. People were doing buildings archaeology long before they realised that that was the title of it. There's been researches into buildings going back certainly into the 19th century, but it was fully professionalised by the mid-80s. And broadly speaking, although there's various ways of looking at structure, we do 3 things. We do a bit of archival research. We try and understand what documents relate to buildings. And this can be maps and plans and diagrams, diaries, newspapers. It can be drawings of the building as it was being constructed. Here you see a title deed of a building which was a pub between 1790. This is the earliest reference to the White Horse at Sybil Hedingham. and remained a pub until it sadly closed in 2012. I say sadly because the incumbent, the incoming landowner was the one who invited me to survey the building after it had been turned into a domestic residence again. I might not have got the opportunity to look at this building had it still be a pub. Nevertheless, archival research, it can take you back a long way, but frequently it doesn't take you back to the origins of really ancient buildings. This was a building, the White Horse at Sybil Hedingham, which had a run of title deeds which stretched back the longest of any that I've seen in my 25-year career. They went back to 1673, when the building was originally a farm called Doves. But the building was 2 centuries older, late 15th century. So we can only trust the archives to go back some way. And even really quite posh buildings, Grade 1 listed great houses, country houses, quite a lot of them don't have the archives going back to their origin. So as a result, we throw the archaeological analysis, the assessment of a building as an object, looking at its material culture. What can its structure tell us? Can we use typologies? Can we use stylistic dating on it? And we'll be looking for things like its form and its function, its materials and its fabric, its setting, its context, and of course, its dating and its phasing to build up an archaeological picture of a building such as the Bell Inn, which you can see me surveying there in Nottingham a couple of years ago. And then on the really good days, we can throw our friends, the dendrochronologists, at these properties as well, and hopefully we can get some nice tree ring dates out of them as well. I've got relatively few pictures of dendrochronologists on the job, and unfortunately none of them come from pubs, but here we see Robert Howard doing some dendro as part of my PhD research at Tattershall. And for those of you who like that sort of thing, the crown post roof there dates to 1446 to 51, but that's an aside, not particularly connected to tonight's subject matter. So these are the things that we can do to try and understand the genuine history and archaeology of a standing building, whether it be a pub or not. So let's just have a think then and use Nottingham as a case study for how we look at pubs and how information can come out of them. There are 3 buildings which claim to be Nottingham's oldest pub, and one of them, the Trip to Jerusalem, claims to be the oldest inn in England, claimed 1189. The Salutation claims to date to 1240, and the Bell Inn, a relative whippersnapper, at 1437. There is a friendly-ish rivalry between the businesses. It can get a little bit heated, but this is a discussion and a debate which you are guaranteed to hear on the streets of my hometown on any night of the week. Which is the oldest of these 3? There's been television programs made on it. It's on the radio. It's in the newspapers quite a bit. So it is a subject which is close to the East Midlands residents' hearts. So we're going to take them in order, and I'm going to briefly explain how we know what we know about these buildings and whether or not their claims genuinely stack up. So the Trip we look at first. This is a building which claims to date to 1189 and to have been a public house since then. Instantly, there's a problem, because the Trip, which you can just see in the far right-hand corner of the screen, it's that white building at the back of the brewhouse yard, the Trip would have been on private land during the entire medieval period. So it was an extramural enclosure of Nottingham Castle, which was royal land. There was no public access, therefore there cannot have been a public house. So instantly that 1189 claim goes out of the window. It was divorced, this area of Nottingham, from the castle in the 17th century. And from that point, there was quite a prominent non-conformist community there, and there were several pubs, and the juncture of those 2 facts lead to lots of court cases, because pubs equal drinking equals bad behaviour equals arrests. So we know an awfully large amount about the buildings that were down there. And as I say, there was about half a dozen pubs. throughout the post-medieval period. So we hear about the different buildings and businesses, and there's no mention of the trip to Jerusalem for quite a while. The property at its oldest, including the famous caves out the back and the timber frame structure, which you see on the right-hand side, is all 17th century. So there's not a bit of it that's medieval at all, and there's no evidence for any medieval structure, including those caves. Everything was constructed during the 17th century redevelopment of Brewhouse Yard when it was divorced from the castle. So that's the point where we can start to see our earliest knowledge of this famous building. And there's no record of it as a pub until 1751. And actually it appears in the History and Antiquities of Nottingham by Charles Deering rather than a court case. But that's the first reference. So it's a 17th century building, and by the mid-18th century it was a pub, and it gets the famous name, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem, by 1799 when it's referred to in Willoughby's Directory. So that 1189 claim, which is prominently painted on the side of the pub, is on very shaky ground right from the beginning. And what I would say is that signage fits into something which I call pub law, which I think is a separate branch of folklore, quite frankly. I do think that all pub websites should be disallowed from having a tab which says history on it. Because to the best of my knowledge, and I've looked at a lot of these buildings, there isn't a single pub anywhere in the country with an accurate date on its sign. And I genuinely mean that. That's not hyperbole. I can't think of a single one. So we should be thinking of these as stories. These are tales that are often dreamed up quite cynically to pull in the punters. And here we see the trip's origin claim, which dates to 1189, and it's where the Crusaders met for a pint before trotting off to fight in the Holy Land. I mean, there's problems with this in several ways. Namely, there was no muster of Crusaders. Again, that's something we know quite a lot about. Richard I's Crusaders mustered in Normandy, not even in England. There was a small gathering in Southampton, but they don't mention the name of the pub. So pub law is quite a familiar thing, and this will come back throughout the talk, really. There has been deliberate myth-making. There are ways of getting at how this 1189 story first came to be printed on the side of the building. The signage only appeared in 1909. There's lots of illustrations of the trip before and after, and you can see it appearing there, 1909. That's the year when it first comes up there. And what happened in 1909 is a much bigger pub to the right of the building as you look at it on the screen was demolished then. The much bigger pub was called the Gatehangs Well, and it was vast, it was way taller, and it came out, and it blocked the view of the trip to Jerusalem from the roadside where I'm stood there. And what happened is that was demolished in 1909, the business failed, the trip carried on, and the landlord, George Ward, got his little paint pot out and thought, advertising opportunity. And that's when the famous lettering goes on the side. And Harry Gill, who was a Nottingham architect and a prominent member of the Thoroton Society, the county group of antiquarians, he wrote an article at exactly that moment on the old inns of Brewhouse Yard. And he tells us that Gill, in that year, started distributing trade cards, business cards, essentially, which have, for the first time, the legend of the trip and the Crusaders on it and the 1189 claim. And Gill tells us that the wording of that trade card says it will be found on reference to old historical books that it was so called in 1189 when the Crusaders left for Jerusalem. Well, those old historical books have never manifested. No one's ever found them. George Ward, the landlord, invented this. This was his marketing ploy. This was his way of drawing in the punters. And by the middle years of the 1930s, the press were repeating this, and there hasn't been a single year since when the trip isn't referred to as a pub dating to 1189. So it worked. People are still coming to this building, but it was a cynical marketing ploy by a landlord who spotted the chance to sell the place as a result of demolition. So there's been deliberate myth-making. And this, I suppose, has led the knowledge that the trip's story is perhaps not built on fact, has led to other claimants in the town. Here we see the Salutation, one of our grassroots music venues, and a long-lived, well-known pub in the town. And this is genuinely a medieval building. We're on safe ground here. Their claim is to date to 1240 AD, and although I've not been able to survey this myself, we shall maybe gloss over there, but the landlords are not particularly keen on having me on site. We do know that there is a crown post roof within it. Now, this is not a photograph of that crown post roof. It's some other Nottinghamshire crown post, so you can see what it would look like. It was surveyed by my mentor, Philip Dixon, in the 90s as part of the History Hunters programme. And we're fortunate to still have a kind of a reference to that on the internet, a description of what they did during that programme. It's available on the Internet Archive. And Phil went and looked at a crown post roof. Now, crown posts in Nottinghamshire, we would expect to find them from about 1310 to about 1470. There aren't any crown posts anywhere in the country that predate the 1270s. So they're claimed to date to 1240, shaky ground. Actually, it's a building that, as part of the History Hunters programme, was tree ring sampled, and the date of 1440 came back for that crown post roof. So we know about the date of that. So the building is 2 centuries later than the claim, and it was built as a domestic house, not a pub. So you can see that it was a house, much like the Trip, that became a pub. It was converted, but no reference to a pub until 1725 in the will of Samuel Hudson. So claiming 1240, but really a pub by the early years of the 18th century. So we're getting somewhere. We've got a medieval building this time. It's just that it wasn't a pub until a bit later on. The other one, the Bell, is the most interesting case. It doesn't look very old from the exterior. That frontage dates to about 1820. But behind it, there is something which is genuinely medieval again. Stylistically, it's got another crown post roof, although a little bit unloved. It's all been blocked in and partitioned off, but there you can see the crown post itself with the bracing supporting the roof structure. So we know, again, we're in that 14th, 15th century period on stylistic grounds, but it is another one where we have some really safe dendrochronology. And it's plus or minus 10 years from 1442, which is pretty close to its claim, actually. They claim 1437. Now, the dendro isn't that close, but it's certainly within the tolerance. So although it's not one of those pub signs that actually is accurate, it's not far out. And that does make it, actually, Nottingham's oldest pub, because we do have, again, a will referencing this as a pub by 1638. And here, Robert Sherwin granted some of the profits from the building to the 3 parishes of Nottingham: St Nicholas, not pictured here, St Mary's and St Peter's. So that's the oldest, but you can see the variables. You can see the problem with pub history. All of these buildings were constructed as domestic or commercial shops, and are then later turned into pubs, but none of them have the date that's proclaimed on the sign. And this plays out in pub history wherever you look, particularly with those who are claiming to be the oldest. So just to sort of sum up, therefore, the Trip to Jerusalem claims 1189, but the archaeology suggests a 17th century building, and it's a pub by 1751. The Sal claims 1240. The archaeology is early 15th century, with archives showing conversion to a pub by 1725. And the Bell, fairly accurate claim of 1437, and the archaeology backs that up closely, early 15th century, and then the archives tell us that it was a pub by the 17th century. You can see how you do this by using all the tools in the toolkit to try and get at the truth of it. There is an irony that just down the way is a genuine purpose-built medieval pub. This is the Flying Horse. Again, it doesn't look medieval because it has a 1930s frontage. You could walk to this in under 1 minute from the Bell. It's just the other side of the market square. This was established, it says they claim 1483. It's somewhere in the later 15th century. It genuinely does have a timber frame, which is of that late medieval period behind it, and it did continuous service until 1989 when it closed, and it's now a coffee shop and clothes shop. If they'd carried on, it would have a claim to be one of Britain's oldest pubs. So we've been cheated in Nottingham. The Trip and the Sal are not alone in claiming to be the oldest pub in the country. This is a list which I refer to as the usual suspects. Now, there are a few more than this, but there are 10 or so pubs which keep coming up in all of the popular articles, popular books, which get printed online and in hard copy. And they are all claimants. And you'll notice there's a fairly even spread across the country of these. Every part of the country wants skin in the game. Everyone wants their local to be the oldest. Now, there are others which don't make this list, but these are the ones that keep coming up and nicely articulated on the website, thedrinksbusiness.com there. You can see that there's a fair span of dates, the earliest being the old ferryboat inn at Holywell, and they claim to date to 560 AD. Now, more on that in a second, and it stretches all the way through to the mid-13th century, with the Adam and Eve at Norwich. And people from Norfolk really go hard for that claimant. I get a fair amount of abuse online for saying that that one might not stack up. There are certain bits of evidence which are brought to bear with regard to many of these buildings when they try and back themselves up, when they try and explain how they know what they are claiming on the sites. And here is the old ferryboat inn at Holywell in Cambridgeshire, one of East Anglia's claimants. And here we see that it's based on the archaeology and also archival records. There are even records of drinks being sold here as early as 560 AD. Now, let's just reel back from that for a second. This is a period of time when we can't even be sure if King Arthur was real. So how can we be sure that they were serving up pub drinks in this building? There is no record because essentially most people will take that at face value. They're not like us, most people. They won't know the difference between a 6th century building and a late medieval into 17th century building because it's not most people's concern. And they trust that businesses will be telling them the truth. Most people will go there for a nice Sunday afternoon meal, a few drinks, look out at the river, that kind of thing. The problem being, of course, is that we don't have any pre-Norman domestic buildings standing anywhere in the country. There's about 400 churches which have bits of early medieval architecture in them. There's a couple of bits of town walls and the like, but we're not really looking at houses and especially pubs. So we can't really trust these claims at face value. Some of them claim to be in the Domesday Book. There's about 3 or 4 of them which say, we know we're this old, we know that we were around in the Domesday Book, one of them being the Royal Standard of England. Curiously, an unlisted building. This probably is quite an ancient building. I suspect it's probably at least early modern, and there might be something medieval lurking within. Curiously, it's never been listed, though, so we know relatively little about it. Despite the fact it appears lots in the film Hot Fuzz, which is one of the best ways of finding out what the interior of it looked like by watching Simon Pegg and Nick Frost drinking in there. The landlord claims that we had a guy do some extensive research, and he found there was a record in the Domesday Book that there was something here then. Naughty, naughty, because there isn't, because there aren't any pubs mentioned anywhere in the Domesday Book. It's freely available online. You can go and check it. There are no pubs in the Domesday Book. So we have to be careful when we see that claim coming up. Others claim to be licensed from a very early period of time. And of course, that's something we can check. One of them is close to us here tonight. Actually, we could probably all go here for a pint afterwards, should we want to risk it, bearing in mind my book's been out for 8 months now, and I'm pretty sure I'm barred. The White Hart claims to be licensed in 1216, which is quite the claim for a building which is early 20th century in its entirety. There was an earlier pub here in the early 19th century, so it lasted for about a century before it was rebuilt, but there's no evidence of anything earlier than that. And licensing did not come in until 1552. So if you ever see a claim for somewhere like 1216, you know you're on hiding to nothing. So pub licenses are a little bit of a red herring. So there's all sorts of evidence that is brought to bear to back up those claims, but if we're actually going to do our job and we're going to properly go and have a look for Britain's oldest pub, let's try and do it properly. Let's use buildings archaeology, not just to debunk and myth bust and try and talk down some of the claims, but let's actually do the opposite of that. Let's go back to basics, first principles, and see if we can find some genuinely ancient pubs which might still exist in the landscape. So I set some parameters, and as you can see from the picture, the picture that is quite murky, it's quite muddy, so we need to be clear what we're looking at. And to my mind, it was pretty simple what we should be looking for. It's a purpose-built structure that's still operating as a pub, i.e., it was built as a pub, it's done continuous service, and it is still a pub. And in demonstrating that, we can use the archival evidence and the archaeological and tree ring dating to hopefully bring to bear to explain which pubs have come down to us from the medieval period. Quick caveat, there's 3 or 4 different types of pubs in the medieval period. The most prevalent are ale houses, and they do what they say on the tin. It's a place to go and get ale. Now, most of these buildings are actually doing off sales. They put out the Green Branch, an early forerunner of the pub sign, when they've got surplus stock. A lot of brewing is being done by alewives, so it's a feminine pursuit throughout the early medieval and high medieval period. And when they've got more than they need for family consumption, they're selling it. And it's a bit like a modern microbrew pub that perhaps only opens on certain days. My own local microbrewery, the Neon Raptor, does this. It only opens 3 or 4 days a week, and you can get off sales there, but you can also sit down within the brewery. And I think a bit of that was probably happening in the medieval period too. You can imagine that you might go there with your jug to buy some off sales and then sit down and have a jar with the landlady and maybe some other customers too. And Edward Roberts, in his article on late medieval inns in Hampshire, points out that actually alehouses probably archaeologically look just like an ordinary domestic house. And we can't go and find these things. We cannot spot them. We might have buildings which were genuinely used as alehouses in the medieval period. It could be this one from Borehunt in Hampshire, but we don't have the archives to go with it, even though we know that alehouses were the most numerous of the types of pubs. So we have to cross that one off. It's quite sad, but we can't find these alehouses, certainly not in the medieval period. Less numerous were taverns, and these do something very, very different. These are posh, and they are urban, and they are intended for an elite customer base. Posh folk who drink wine. At this period, as today, there is an upper class association between drinking wine and your status in society. The people that would visit the taverns in the medieval period are, in the modern period, the people who are probably looking at the top shelf on the wine rack in Waitrose, for example. You've got a few quid in your pocket to go to a tavern. Now, some of these buildings do survive. There's a really good one, which was called the Paradise Tavern, mid-14th century property, was in use as a tavern throughout the medieval period in Winchester, 40 to 42 High Street, but it's now a shop. And all the other taverns that we know about have gone that way as well or no longer exist. So unfortunately, we can't go and look for taverns, but we can look for inns. Inns survive, some of them do. Many of them are not in use as inns any longer. but there are a small number which are still operational. Now, inns grow up in a curious way. They come out of the monastic world. There's a need to provide respite for travellers, if you're a monastery, because you want to attract those pilgrims to your monastery, to visit your shrine, to hopefully patronise your house. It brings money into the monastery. So they start providing free guest houses, and they'll give you somewhere to bed down, and they'll give you some bread and beer. By the later 12th century, some of the monasteries have realised that there are pilgrims who don't necessarily want to bed down with everybody else. They want something a bit smarter, a bit more private. Essentially, they want something higher status. And so from the late 12th century and gaining ground in the 13th and especially 14th century, we start to see these purpose-built inns that operate a bit like a modern hotel. So you can pay for a room, you can pay for some food, you can pay for something to drink. And some of them do survive. So we've got these guest houses, such as the one at St Mary's Abbey, which are buried deep within the DNA of the inn. And then we get the purpose-built commercial inns, such as the George at Glastonbury, which dates to basically the reign of Edward IV, who's just on the wall over there. And it's one of the earlier ones. There is, of course, a bit of a tension here, because an inn, a bit like a hotel, is not exactly like a modern pub, but there's a blurring that goes on here. In the same way that some hotels, they don't have an open bar for non-residents, and they don't serve food to non-residents. There are also some pubs that do rooms, some pubs that do food as well. So there's a blurring. But the DNA of the modern pub, which really grows up in the 18th and 19th centuries, does have the medieval inn embedded within it. And some of them are still in use as public houses and indeed hotels, such as the George at Glastonbury. I went to a stunningly debauched wedding there in the year 2001, so I can confirm that you can definitely get a drink there. So we've got these inns. And many of these inns do have these ecclesiastical links at their early period in time. Now, I can see there's a few people in the room who are muttering away and pointing at the screen, and they've recognised the new inn at Gloucester. It's probably the best preserved inn that we've got. I stayed here on my book tour when I spoke at Gloucester History Festival. It's the third time I've stayed there, and it's quite a treat. A real treat to stay here, because it still recognisably looks like a medieval inn. And it was founded, it used to be thought that it was founded in the 1450s, but the dendrochronology tells us it was there about 20 years previous, for John Twining, who was a monk of Gloucester Abbey, and it's being developed as one of these big commercial inns by a monastery, driving custom, if you like, to their shrines. And of course, around this period, we've got the commission of the tomb of Edward II, which was very, very popular. And of course, we still have that there now. So there's a strong connection between many of these inns and the ecclesiastical world. But some of them are nakedly commercial. It's not just driving traffic and supporting traffic to the monasteries for the shrines. It's there purely for commerce. So here's the George Inn at Norton St Philip in Somerset, late 14th century foundation. And this is there because the monks, the Carthusian monks of Hinton Charterhouse, 2 miles up the road, have got these incredibly popular wool fairs and also a weekly market. And they've decided that the priory precinct is getting a bit noisy. So they move their market and their fairs down the road to Norton St Philip. And it's so popular that they build this enormous inn, and it really is vast, 3-storey inn. And they're raking it in, absolutely raking it in. 1530, not only do you pay for staying there, pay for your beer, pay for your bread, but when you're a merchant, you're paying 1.5 pence per pack just to store your goods there. And then you're paying a 4p toll per pack when you sell it on as well. They're taking money left, right and centre, and they're really, really coining it as a result. And this is really not connected to shrines and pilgrimage at all. It's naked commerce, but it is commerce that's being driven by the monastery. Pretty much all of our surviving inns are in urban locations. They're big foundations, therefore they need lots and lots of traffic coming through them. And they plan where they are quite cunningly. They're often close to the gates, either within or without. They're on the main thoroughfares. And here, the Saracen's Head, formerly the King's Head, there's a name change there, actually. Sorry, this is a digression, but there's a name change that occurs in the later 17th century from the King's Head to the Saracen's Head, because this is actually where Charles I pitched up the day he surrendered. And this was first contact with Parliament, and it was generally considered to be a poor political decision to maintain the name King's Head after what happened to him 3 years later. So it's now the Saracen's Head. But the location of this is very significant. There's a staggered crossroad in the town of Southwell, and the Saracen's Head sits just back from that staggered crossroad, so it's on the main routes through the town, and it's directly opposite one corner of the Minster Yard, and this is one of the minsters of the Archdiocese of York, and it's still a popular spot to this day. So they've chosen the landscape setting to maximise the amount of commerce and business that the building can support. So they're in prominent spots, and you know it was an inn for all sorts of reasons. One of those, of course, is you've got the famous inn sign. They're all pictorial. Here we see the one at the George. This is not medieval, but we can imagine that something akin to this hung there in the 14th and 15th centuries, and they pick out the name of the inn. I'm not quite sure what they would have done with the new inn at Gloucester, though. I'm not quite sure how that would have worked. But all sorts of different pictorial images. At the angel at Grantham, it is literally that. It is an angel holding a crown, for example. And there are lots of these early inns which are called the George, and I think that's a reference to the patronal saint, of course, which is gaining in popularity as a direct result of the very nationalistic enterprises of particularly Edward III and Henry V. So you'll spot the sign, but the other big clue that this is an inn is the enormous gateways, the portals into these buildings. They need to be big and they need to be wide to take carts, wagons, horses, and lots of traffic in and out of the courtyards. Lots of properties claiming to be inns, including the trip to Jerusalem, just simply don't have these portals. Again, it's a way of discounting them as inns, because you really need this access route into the building. So always be on the lookout for either those big gate portals or, in fact, blocked gate portals. Some of them do get filled in and the space is used. It must be noted that either side of some of these gate portals, in a lot of these urban inns, they do have shops. So it's a multifunctional space. They're hedging their bets as to how the money comes in. And in much the same way that in the last slide, there are still shops in the frontage of the new inn at Gloucester. There always were. And it's the same case at the Henry Tudor Inn here in Shrewsbury. What's now called Snoop, the yarn shop, has always been a shop. Interesting aside here as well, 1429 painted on the sign there. I said that they're always inaccurate. Yeah, the dendrochronology of this building, 1426. They've actually done themselves out of 3 years. I'm not quite sure why. That's a recent sign. That's in the last couple of years. So it's quite a strange thing to do, that was. Whether or not the sign writer turned the 6 upside down, I'm not sure. But if they had gone for 1426, it would be the only one that was accurate. This is right on the main thoroughfare from the English Bridge coming up from Shrewsbury Abbey, a building that was founded for the local MP Hugh Wigan and was built 1426, and the other dendro is 1431 to 32 from this building. So you can see the successive building campaigns, but it always had shops either side of the gate portal. When you get past the sign and the portal and the shops and the like, you come into courtyards. There's always at least one decent-sized courtyard for congregating, for sort of considering your next move, for starting to stow away your packs, for considering where you're going to go for your bread and beer, and also making arrangements for going to your chambers afterwards. They vary in shape and size. Some of them are very long and narrow. This is a fairly standard one at the New Inn, famously used in the early modern period and still in the modern era for the performance of plays, although of course that probably wouldn't have been one of the functions that occurred during the 15th century. But that courtyard, therefore, for congregating, considering your next move. And the first thing you're going to do is want to stow away your packs, stow away your horses, carts, wagons, and the like. And those stables are always at the back. You keep the noisy stuff away from the posh frontages. At the New Inn, there's a separate courtyard, which we've lost most of. But there was a separate stables courtyard. At the George Inn at Norton, it's just a single courtyard, and this is the building right at the back behind that great big frontage that we saw before, which is where the stables were. And we've got good dendro for this, and that's of the 1450s that structure was built. It's now the most important room in that pub because that's actually where the bar is located. So it's gone right up in status, in my opinion. Then I think once you've sort of got rid of your packs and stabled your horse, etc., it's time to go to your room. And there would be staircases coming up from the courtyard which would take you onto these open-sided galleries, a bit like an unglazed corridor. Corridors are interesting because they don't really reach domestic houses until the later 17th century, but this is kind of a precursor of it, and it allows access off the pentis, if you like, into chambers. And the galleries, which are another real clue that the building was in use as an inn, do survive from the mid-16th century at Norton St Philip, but from the early 15th century at Gloucester. And these allow access into chambers. This was actually my room the second time I stayed at Gloucester. It's been subdivided, it's been made slightly smaller, but the chambers at the New Inn at Gloucester, there was 20 of them, and it's been estimated that the New Inn could hold about 200 people. So again, you can imagine these big groups of travellers, possibly even the itinerant riding household of elite lords staying at these places. Richard III is known to have stopped at the Angel at Grantham, for example. And we know something of the chambers from later inventories. They do have signs on the doors, which, well, their names are very reminiscent of pubs. Again, the Crown, the Rose, the Flower, the Three Tons, the Angel, these are all still pub names. But again, it's a semi-literate society, so this is how you know which room you're going into. There's a picture on the door. And then within, the Cardinal's Hat, which is an early converted domestic house in Lincoln, which was certainly an inn by about 1510. We hear that the Great Chamber, so the poshest room for the poshest visitors, has curtained beds and truckle beds and a big table and a square table, a couple of chairs, some stools, some cushions, some chests, and of course a commode. We don't know much about going to the toilet in these places, but clearly place of drink, you need toilets. So we do hear that the chambers have commodes in them, close stools. There is a site in Hampshire which does have some evidence for box garderobes which overhung a ditch at the back. But ensuite wasn't a big thing at this period in time. Then you would go down from your chamber, in certain cases, to receive your repast. Some people, of course, the posher people, would have the food and drink brought to their room, but maybe the lower status members of households might congregate in the hall. And your food, your drink is being brought to a hatch. You're not going up to a bar as you would do in a 19th or 20th century pub. They don't have the hand pumps there with the optics behind. This is all of the 19th century. There's a hatch, the buttery hatch, and that is approached by servants. So they do table service, just like it was during COVID. Exactly like that. You sit down at your table, the servant comes to you, you make your order, off the servant goes to the buttery hatch, And then within, there are more servants who bring out your food, bring out your drink in jugs, poured off from casks in the back room. And this is actually the services as they are now at the George Inn at Norton St Philip. And I'm quite looking forward to speaking in this room in April. I'm doing an event there, and that's the room where we're going to do this. So that's the services, and it's just like a domestic house with a cross passage, services on one side, hall and parlour on the other. And this is, again, at the George Inn, the hall on the left-hand side and the parlour on the right. They're heated. They have chimney pieces put in during the mid-16th century. You'll notice the hall's quite small. It's only really the size of one of the bigger domestic houses. And again, that's an indicator that lots of people are not congregating in these spaces, that they are probably eating and drinking in their rooms, room service, essentially. And then the parlour beyond the hall, for those people who maybe want something a little bit more semi-private, semi-public, they don't want to be completely away in their own chambers. So you go to the parlour for something a little bit more private. These rooms survive and they're completely legible and readable. But it must be said that these are definitely places where you can get a drink. This idea of the buttery hatch, the buttery bar, is referred to in certainly early modern tracts. We can see references to, the first reference to a bar comes from Robert Greene, 1592. Shakespeare has the buttery bar, but remember, these are not bars like we have in the modern period. They are really hatches. If you want to get a sense of what that would have been like, I'd recommend visiting the Square and Compass at Worth Matravers in Dorset, where the bar there is still a hatch at the end of a corridor. It's a bit of a nightmare to get served there because they're usually queuing all the way down the corridor and then out into the beer garden. And then they do genuinely then go out to the back and pour off the beer into your pint glass off gravity. So it's not quite like it was in the medieval period, but it's about as close as you can possibly get. We hear little bits about the rooms for drinking. We do hear that they had these kind of subdivisions in the rooms and also outside as well, which again do make it sound a bit like those perspex screens from the COVID era to create snugs and the like. So the most medieval we have been was in 2020 and 2021, pandemic and plague notwithstanding. It took us back to the way that we used to drink. So there is a sense of continuity with some of these pubs. I'm there having a pint in one of them, and that has been serving for over 600 years. And there's a sort of a weight of history there that isn't there with some of those claimants, such as the Trip and then the rest of them, which, wow, this is remarkable. This is the 77th date of my book tour, I think. And this is about the only time that I've been on time. I've come in under time. Clearly, I'm thinking about going to the pub afterwards. So, you know, we can say, really, well, we can have a go at saying where some of these pubs are. There's a nice little distribution map here of pubs which I've been able to identify and talk to other specialists and buildings archaeologists and the like to really build up a distribution of where there are continuously open inns stretching back to the medieval period. These are all 14th and 15th century. There's nothing older than the late 14th century which is still serving. There are a couple which are older, but they're no longer serving. So what have we got here? What can we say about this distribution map? Well, there's a couple in the East Midlands, there's a couple in East Anglia, there's a line of them down the Welsh Marches, a couple in Somerset, and a group of them in Hampshire and the western home counties. There's not very many. I can only find 14, which have come down to us in continuous service from the medieval period. I wouldn't read too much into this. It's all survivor bias. There are obvious areas where there is nothing. The southeast, where we are now, being obvious in the lack of pubs. The West Midlands, nothing really there. We're looking at areas which have had a really intensive industrial era, which has probably swept properties away, but nothing in the southwest, or Wales, or the north. Now, come on, York or Durham must have had inns. They just haven't survived, even though those two cities do have many other historic buildings. It's all to do with survivor bias, to do with the particular settlement itself. What we can say about most of these settlements is that they tend to be either large villages or towns and cities, so they tend to be urban, and they tend to have been places which more or less avoided the greater predations of the industrial period. And notwithstanding some of the 20th century interventions, particularly at places like Gloucester, they've also got a prevalence of historic standing architecture within them, Shrewsbury and Ludlow being excellent examples there. So we can ask this question, which of these is the oldest? And frankly, you're going to have to get the book to find out, because I'm not going to tell you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, James. That's excellent. I've built up a perishing thirst, clearly. Do we have any questions from the audience? Lovely. Could I ask that when you ask your question, you just say your name so we know who has asked the question as well? Would that be all right?
I'm Professor Grace Iapolo. I'm a Shakespearean, actually. The fascinating talk. I really enjoyed this. So I have just quickly checked a concordance of Shakespeare's plays. He never uses the term pub. He only uses the word tavern, and when he does, it's derogatory. At one point, he compares it to a brothel. So what do you think the term, did the term change from the medieval to the early modern?
Yes, so the question about when does the word pub or public house come into play? It's a 17th century word. That's the first time we start to hear it. And I think, I can't remember the exact earliest citation, the year of it, but I suspect it is after Shakespeare's time. I think it's mid to late 17th century. And it's one of those phrases which does what it says on the tin. It is a house that is in some sense public. But again, that use of the word house, I think, is significant in many regards, because many of these properties do develop out of the design of a domestic house. That idea of the cross passage, the services and the hall and parlour is there in a domestic house, it's there in a great house, a castle and the like. So there's something of that. Of course, many of these customers of these public houses they've got a few quid. They want something that is going to be similar to what they would expect to find at home. But it's a slightly later period, yeah. But it's nice, of course, with these Shakespearean connections, to see that early reference to the buttery bar in the writings of Shakespeare, which is sort of giving you, again, a physical descriptor, namely that there is a bar. It is barring your access, that there is a backstage there, and that's where all the beer is kept securely, so you don't help yourself.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for James? Surely there must be a question. I had a question. A lot of the buildings that you've been looking at have obviously timber-framed elements to them. Are there any that are more entirely stone-built that might come into play in terms of the oldest structures that don't have that option for dendrodating?
Yeah, nice question about sort of materials that are used really. Yeah, the ones that I've mainly referred to have been timber-framed or have a heavy element of timber framing. The earliest part of the George Inn at Norton St Philip, we don't have, of course, dendro for it because it's stone-built. The ground floor of the front range, the street frontage, that stonework, links to the back range, which goes up 3 stories in stone. And they then had to rebuild that in the early 15th century. So the stone element of it, we only know the date of from kind of reading between the lines of the archives, but also the stylistic dating of the fenestration. The window design is characteristically later 14th century. So we've only got a more of a vague grasp on that. But they then had to completely rebuild the frontage, the street frontage, the first and the second floor, and the roof. That's all 15th century dendro. So it's already had a history by the time that they build all of that timber work.
Yeah.
So that one is a bit more complicated because it's in 2 phases. Well, it's in many phases, but the principal earliest phases are in the 14th and then the early 15th century. But there are others which were stone built and impressive. So the Angel at Grantham, which I didn't include a picture of, on the Great North Road, of course, it's the one which we know Richard III stopped at. From the exterior, that really does look like somewhere like Hurstmonceau Castle. It's got that rhythm with the bay windows, with the impressive frontage, with oriel windows. It looks like the sort of building that a great lord would patronise for their courtyard house, if you like. It looks like the gatehouse into somewhere like Knowle or one of those great 15th century houses. And again, they're building that because you've got these great riding households, and they want to patronise something that a lord, or indeed even a king or an archbishop, wouldn't feel uncomfortable staying overnight at. Although we do, of course, have to be careful of the claims, Elizabeth I stayed here, or Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned here, because most of the time these claims are not true, but sometimes with the Richard III claim at the Angel, it is true, but it has that impressive stone frontage. But when you get behind that into the courtyard, all of the architecture is much later, because again, that's a building that's had quite a history to it. So it's only the stone frontage, which is so monumental, that they bothered to keep. And what was behind possibly was always timber framed, and then was replaced in stone and brick at a later period.
Impressive frontage to draw your punters in.
Yeah.
Nice. Yes, sir, come over.
Hi.
Hello.
Niall Hanrahan, heritage consultant. What's the strangest or quirkiest thing you've found in a pub? Has anything ever really stumped you?
Stumped me?
Yeah, you just can't work it out.
Oh, gosh. So, yeah, I have to sort of give... this is like sort of lifting the veil, really, on where I didn't quite get it right. Yeah. The strangest experience in pub archaeology. Let me just try and cast back. Okay, all right. This is not medieval, but in 2019, I got involved in a project in a village called Callum. I alluded to Callum earlier, actually. When Charles I pitched up at the town of Southall and surprised the parliamentarian garrison there, that was in the morning, and he stayed for a few drinks at the King's Head, and then he went 6 or 7 miles down the way to Callum Bridge, and that's where he made the formal surrender to the Scottish army. Well, Callum's quite an interesting medieval village, and a few years ago, a community group formed, and they were trying to understand if there was any ancient surviving buildings within the village, and to understand whether, in fact, the village had moved organically, or in fact been moved as a result of its interrelationship with the hall and the church. It's a sort of a remove from the church. Anyway, that's all more information than you needed. But one of the buildings that I surveyed was the village pub, the Fox. And there were interesting things about the structure. They found some quite nice apotropaic concealed artifacts there during renovation work a few years back, including a mummified cat and various shoes in the roof structure of a 19th century part of the building, lean-to roof. So there was some interesting stuff there. But the landlord there, who was a kind of a local property owner, he had lots of other places too, he got it into his head that he wanted to be Nottinghamshire's oldest pub. And basically, he sat me down and he gave me a massive steak dinner and kept shoving pints across the table to me in what I think was a bribe. I'm not entirely certain, but it wasn't the normal day-to-day behaviour, if you like. And, you know, there's this sort of great ethical concern there, because I knew that the building dated to about 1800. And, you know, we've obviously seen some quite old pubs in Nottinghamshire with the bell, etc. So I knew that there was a bit of concern there. So, yeah, I think it was the attempted bribery of a landlord who wanted me to confirm, you know, using the weight of, I suppose, you know, notoriety of career to sort of say, oh, yes, we've had this archaeologist in. But you can kind of get a sense here that there is an importance placed by a lot of landlords on having the oldest, or having something so significant that it might pull in a few extra visitors, a few extra customers. And I think that is mainly the motivation behind these stories, behind the pub law, that because everybody else is doing it, well, why don't I do it as well? And there is that kind of cynicism along the lines of, well, people don't know the difference between a 12th and a 17th century building, so of course they're going to believe it. And lots of people do, and lots of locals get really quite aerated about it because it becomes an important aspect of local pride. And a bit like you want in your local football team to win the league, you want your local pub to be the oldest as well. So you've kind of got your army of supporters to sort of say, yes, this is the case. And some people don't like it when you debunk these things. And a few weeks ago, somebody drove 140 miles, which would have taken them 3 hours to tell me I was wrong about a pub in Gloucestershire, which I wasn't. The pub in Gloucestershire claims to be 10th century in date and is actually 16th century and didn't open as a pub until the 18th century. But this person felt so determined that they wanted to have their two penneth, which they'd already had using 2 Twitter accounts and 2 email accounts. I mean, it was verging on stalking, really. I didn't feel under threat, though, because my friend that used to be in the British Transport Police was there to protect me. So I was perfectly safe at all times. But it shows you the level, whether it be the locals who want their pubs to be the oldest or the landlords who want their pub to be the oldest. There is an emotional weight behind these claims, and that's why I have to be very, very careful when surveying pubs, and why I generally don't tell people what I do when I rock up to buy a pint. How many have barred you? Recently, the BBC put in an application for me to do some recording in one of the claimants, one of the usual suspects, and we were turned down because they didn't want me to say what I was inevitably going to say. Although, actually, a couple of weeks ago, and this has already been out on another BBC programme, I did some recording at the Saracen's Head in Southall, and they embraced me with open arms because obviously they are one of the oldest ones. So the usual suspects don't like me, but the other list of the 14 or 15 other ones, they do quite like me. So there's I suppose the final point to make on that the usual suspects list of, it's probably about 24 pubs that claim to be the oldest, and the ones that actually do have the chops to back it up. There are no pubs which cross over on that list at all. So, yeah.
Are there any other questions for James this evening? Yes.
Tash.
Hello. So,
Hi, Tash.
Natasha, archaeologist and creative director. James, what is the oldest pub in London? In London.
Well, this is interesting because I've just been commissioned by Historic England to write an article on this subject. And I don't really want to sort of blow my thunder too early because I haven't really done the research on that yet. But within London, there are some relatively old pubs.
The George Inn.
The George Inn at Southwark has got some history to it. Pete Brown's book, which is a popular book by a beer writer called Shakespeare's Local, fantastic book, gives you a fairly convincing popular history of the place, stretching back probably on the site to the late 14th century, but it's one of those Trigger's Broom type places. Namely, there isn't anything late 14th century left standing on the site. It would have been one of those big courtyard inns, but it now is only on one side of the courtyard, and of that range, there's only one bit of it that's particularly old, and that dates to 1678. So that's the oldest standing bit there. But I would have thought that bits of the Cheshire Cheese on Fleet Street are a little bit older than that. But then there are places like the Mayflower down in Rotherhithe, which make all sorts of crazy claims, but are nowhere near as old as they are claiming. So there's the same problem here with places like the Prospect of Whitby, Ye Olde Watling, which are all making these quite ancient claims, the White Hart on Drury Lane, but they don't necessarily have the chops to back them up. So I'm going to be doing a bit more intensive research on London itself over the spring probably, and that will be an article for Historic England. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about something that I only got commissioned to do today.
Oh, of course, it's the George Inn, right? Right?
Probably.
She says from the National
Of course,
Trust.
yes, it's a National Trust building, and here we have a National Trust employee. Yes, of course.
Of course it is. Are there any other questions for James this evening?
Hello, my name's Faith Acker.
Hello again.
Sorry. And I was just wondering what the margin of error is on dendrochronology, and especially the one where you said they're 3 years off. Could that be explained by the time it takes to build something from logs?
The building that I think you refer to there, that's 3 years out on the sign, I think is an error on the part of the sign writer. I can't explain it any other way. And I've been in there quite recently and was having a crack with the manager there. And he was like, yeah, I don't know why it says that either. But the sign was painted before he was commissioned as the manager there. So I genuinely do think it might be one of those, errors of printing, because a 6 and a 9, something like that. In terms of the error for margin of the science of dendrochronology, tree ring dating, is the oldest and the most respected of the scientific dating techniques available to archaeologists. It's been around in one form or another for about 100 years. It started to be used by archaeologists in particularly Ireland in the 1970s. And by the 1990s, it had really started to gain ground. I sometimes think it's a bit crazy to think that dendrochronology really came of age within my own career, which sort of dates me horribly in one sense. It really does tell you how long I've been doing this now. But certainly from the 90s, we've started to really gather lots of data. And now every year, the Vernacular Architecture Group publishes all of the dendrochronology that's happened in that year in its journal, and then they add that data to master chronologies, which are freely available as Excel spreadsheets. So basically, you can find out every building that's ever been dendroed by going on to the Vernacular Architecture Group website. Brilliant resource, was fundamentally useful in not just the pub chapter of this book, but in many other elements of writing this book, but also my research. And it's pretty accurate, to be honest with you. When people like Martin Bridge and Dan Miles and Robert Howard and Matt Herford and the rest of them, when they obtain their samples, and sometimes they can tell you not just the year of felling, at 1426 in the case of Henry Tudor Inn, they can sometimes even tell you the season when the timber came down. Now, it doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes they'll only be able to give you a felling range. And that's where they haven't got the final year where the tree was dropped. They haven't got what's called the waney edge, which is the interface between the last year of growth and the bark, or indeed the bark. And sometimes you do get the bark surviving on these timbers. I've seen that quite a lot recently, actually. And when you've just got the live tissue, what's called the sapwood, they know that will grow in a piece of oak for 15 to 40 years. So if you've got so many rings of the sapwood surviving, they can give you a range. Well, it came down between these years. And, sometimes that can be quite wide. One of the issues that we sometimes get is that the dendro doesn't work at all. And this can be because the property was built with a timber other than oak. It doesn't happen that often, but if you get elm, you can't dendro it. And then we get places like Knoll, which Natalie and I have worked at, where every time we put, Ian Tyers, I was just trying to remember his name. Ian Tyers did the dendro there. Every time he put a drill near a bit of early modern timber, we were getting felling dates, we were getting seasons, all that kind of thing. Anytime he put a drill into a suspected medieval timber, nothing. And he reckoned it was because all of the timber was grown in open parklands. So it wasn't showing the environmental stress that a tree in a wood would be exposed to because of competition for growth. So it would be under stress. So it would show you it grows in a much more even way because it's open. It's not got other trees competing with it. And as a result, that medieval timber, we didn't get a single date out of it, even though we were absolutely certain on stylistic grounds that was a bit of the medieval building. We didn't get a single date out of it. So there are all sorts of variables. If the timber's in particularly rotten condition, if you don't have 55 growth rings, statistically you can't be certain. Obviously the growth ring issue. There's all sorts of issues. Also, if you've only got heartwood, you can't date it as well. You need to have the sapwood or the waning edge or the bark. But when it works, it really, really works. I've worked on a project on a farm where I was pretty certain that phase 2 dated to 1600 to 1650. And when the dendro came back, it was the spring of 1651. So I was 6 months out, but that's not bad. When it works, it can really, really help you out. So, yeah. But I think in terms of Shrewsbury, it was they turned a 9 round the wrong way.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to draw this evening's proceedings to a close, if that's okay. So a huge thank you to all of you here in the room tonight, and anyone who's been watching online as well. Huge thank you to James.
You're welcome.
And just a notice of our next meeting, which will be in March. I can't remember the date, but it will be a month or so from today, which is a paper by Dr. Hannah Fluck, who will be talking about archaeology in time of climate change. So Hannah is the Senior National Archaeologist for the National Trust. So promises to be a great evening. Thank you all for coming again, and see you all again.